Mandell Creighton was a British historian and a bishop of the Church of England. A scholar of the Renaissance papacy, Creighton was the first occupant of the Dixie chair of Ecclesiastical history at the University of Cambridge, a professorship established around the time that history was emerging as an independent academic discipline. He was also the first editor of the English Historical Review, the oldest English-language academic journal in the field of history. Creighton had a second career as a cleric in the Church of England. He served as a parish priest in Embleton, Northumberland, and later, successively, as the Bishop of Peterborough and the Bishop of London. His moderation and worldliness drew praise from Queen Victoria and won notice from politicians. It was widely thought at the time that Creighton would have become the Archbishop of Canterbury had his early death, at age 57, not supervened. Creighton's historical work received mixed reviews. He was praised for scrupulous even-handedness, but criticized for not taking a stand against historical excesses. For his part, he was firm in asserting that public figures be judged for their public acts, not private ones. His preference for the concrete to the abstract diffused through his writings on the Church of England. He believed that the Church was uniquely shaped by its particular English circumstances, and advocated that it reflect the views and wishes of the English people. Creighton was married to the author and future women's suffrage activist Louise Creighton, and the couple had 7 children. The Creightons were passionately interested in the education of children and together wrote over a dozen school history primers. A man of complex intelligence and exceptional vigor, Mandell Creighton was emblematic of the Victorian era both in his strengths and in his failings. Early childhood 1843 to 1857. Mandell Creighton was born on 5 July 1843 in the border country city of Carlisle, Cumberland, to Sarah and Robert Creighton. His father, a carpenter, had built a successful cabinet-making and decorating business on Castle Street, the main thoroughfare in Carlisle. A year later another son, James, was born to the couple, and in 1846, a daughter, Mary, who died before the year was out. In 1849, another daughter, Mary Ellen, was born, and the following year Sarah Creighton died unexpectedly. Robert, who never remarried, and never spoke of his wife again, raised the children with help from his unmarried sister who came to live with the family. A self-made man, Robert Creighton constantly exhorted his sons to work. However, he also imbued them with a sense of independence. This later allowed Mandell to make career choices that were unorthodox for his background. For his part, his brother James would join his father's carpentry business, enter local politics, be twice elected mayor of Carlisle, and later become a director of North British Railway. Polly, by contrast, considered her childhood to be horridly unhappy. Not being able to complete her school education, she never acquired the sophistication that she so greatly valued. Even so, she would spend her adult life promoting the education of children, and in 1927 become the first woman to be granted freedom of the city of Carlisle. The family living quarters above the shop were spacious but Spartan. There was little decoration and few books. As Robert, moreover, was given to losing his temper easily, the household atmosphere was dreary and fearful. Years later, Mandell Creighton's wife was to speculate that the absence in her husband's childhood of a sense of belonging to a family was very likely the result of not having a mother. Creighton's education began in a nearby dame's school, run by a stern headmistress, where his restlessness and mischief often brought down punishment upon him. In 1852, he moved to the local cathedral school. There, under the influence of a charismatic headmaster, the Rev. William Bell, he began to read voraciously and to succeed academically. Other students came seeking his help in translating passages from the classical studies. They soon gave him the nickname Homer on account of his quickness at construing. In November 1857, he took the King's Scholarship examination for admission to Durham Grammar School, located 70 miles away. His Carlisle teachers had not prepared him for translation of Latin verse. He left a portion of the exam unanswered and felt certain he had failed. The examiners, however, assessed his overall performance to be good and decided to accept him. In February 1858, the 15-year-old Creighton left Carlisle for Durham Grammar School, 1858 to 1862. The Durham Grammar School required its students to attend services in the 11th century Durham Cathedral on Sundays and holy days. The cathedral's high church ceremony made a lasting impression on Creighton. It became a focus of his religious life and would later influence his choice of career. Durham's headmaster, Dr. Henry Holden, a classical scholar and an educational reformer, was soon taking interest in the new student. With Holden's encouragement, Creighton began to win prizes in classical subjects, in English, and in French. During his last year at Durham, he was promoted to head boy of the school, a position that appealed to his great desire to influence people, especially younger boys. Although he aimed to do this by setting an example with his high moral life, he did not, in an era of universal corporal punishment, hesitate to use the rod. In a letter written to a Durham school monitor after Creighton had left the school, he advised, "Remember, never thrash a fellow a little, always hard, and it is always well that he be thrashed by more than one of the monitors." Creighton was severely short-sighted. He also suffered from double vision, which forced him to read with one eye closed. Since the visual handicap also limited his participation in vigorous sport, he took enthusiastically to walking. His tours of the countryside, often with companions, covered over 20 miles a day and lasted several days. Walking gave him many opportunities to exercise his abiding curiosity in the local botany and architecture. The habit was to remain with him for rest of his life. In the spring of 1862, Creighton applied unsuccessfully for a scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford. He applied next to Merton College, Oxford, for a classical postmastership. His application proved successful and Creighton arrived in Oxford in October 1862. He continued to take great interest in the Durham Grammar School. In a hand-me-down family story, he is said, in 1866, to have walked from Oxford to Durham in 3 days to hear speeches at a school function. Oxford undergraduate, 1862 to 1866. Creighton's postmastership of £70 a year was enough to cover his tuition at Merton, but not much more. For his other expenses he had to ask his father, whose gruff manner made asking difficult. Under the circumstances, Creighton lived economically in college attic rooms for most of his time at Merton. In his last year he moved out of college to share rooms with George Saintsbury, the future author and wine critic. Although Creighton's short-sightedness prevented his participation in cricket and football, he was able to join the college rowing team. He continued to go on walks, these, especially around Oxford for a few hours in the late afternoon, were popular among many students. Creighton, characteristically, organized longer walks, some lasting all day. Creighton's reading continued to flourish, and not just of books prescribed in the syllabus. He reads so voraciously that he sometimes stayed at Oxford during vacations in order to read. Among writers and poets, he became particularly fond of Carlyle, Browning, Tennyson and Swinburne. He was also becoming politically aware. If pressed, he professed a liberalism based on the autonomy of the individual. He joined the Oxford Union, and although he seldom gave public speeches there, he was elected Union president. He especially honed his skills in informal conversations, conducted anywhere and everywhere about topics great and small, bearing easily the yoke of what Gladstone later was to dub Oxford's agony, the habit pursuit of seeing self-importantly, larger-than-life significance in Oxford's everyday disputes. Creighton came seriously to believe that it was the responsibility of all individuals to influence others to the full extent of their abilities. He sought others out to influence and instruct. Predictably, among his Merton friends, he received the nickname the Professor or P. In his second year, he and 3 other students became inseparable, both during academic terms and vacations, forming a group called the Quadrilateral. The group friendship was intense, like many such in the time. Although Creighton had a large circle of friends, he did not form any close friendships with women during this time. In his final term, he wrote to a friend, "Ladies in general are very unsatisfactory mental food. They seem to have no particular thoughts or ideas." Academically, Creighton's goal became the pursuit of an honours degree in Literae Humanae Ors, a classical studies curriculum attracting the best students at Oxford. In the final examinations, in the spring of his 4th year, he received a first class, joining immediately the School of Law and Modern History, and studying all summer. He took the examinations in that school in autumn 1866. He received a second class this time, his examiners assessing that he had not mastered the details enough. However, since the Literae Humanae Ors degree was the more established one, he was asked by the classics professor, Benjamin Jowett, to apply for a college teaching fellowship. As it turned out, he did not have to. He had decided that he would go on to accept holy orders, and his own college, Merton, offered him a clerical fellowship with tutorial duties on the 22nd of December 1866, teaching and marriage 1867 to 1874. During the second half of the 19th century, a number of academic reforms were instituted at the University of Oxford, beginning with the Oxford University Act of 1854. By the 1860s, the reforms had trickled down the colleges. Among the changes were the new responsibilities given to college tutors. These instructors, whose primary job was to give personalized instruction in the rooms to undergraduates, were now tasked with the preparation of students for the university's examinations. Previously, the responsibility of the university-wide instructors, such as professors, as the tutors were chosen from distinguished recent graduates. The new instructional staff were more youthful than the old. At this time, Merton College was suffering from student unrest stemming from what was seen as a lack of leadership in the teaching faculty. Many fellows, both resident and non-resident, had become distant presences. As Creighton was popular with students, he was looked upon as someone who would exercise that leadership. He proceeded to do so by appealing both to the students' reasoning and to the good sense, and by simultaneously immersing himself among them. He was given more responsibilities. These, in the wake, brought promotions and salary increases. After 4 years of teaching, his salary had more than doubled. He joined forces with a Merton tutor to open collegiate lectures to students of other colleges and received the college's authorization. Soon, the Association of Tutors was born, as well as an Oxford-wide series of lectures that any student could attend. The lectures were to influence his choice of future research. He wrote later, "We worked out among us a scheme of lectures covering the whole field, and were the pioneers of the intercollegiate lectures, which now prevail at both universities. The needs of this scheme threw upon me the ecclesiastical, and especially papal history, which no one else took. Religious beliefs were also undergoing an upheaval. Many Victorian intellectuals, who had been raised in Christian households, had, in their adult life, begun to experience religious doubt and were moving in secular directions." Creighton, in contrast, was slowly solidifying his religious beliefs. While his high church views had moderated somewhat, he never had any crisis of confidence. He had no interest in the new natural sciences, and was unmoved to read Darwin, regarding his writings as too much speculation. Creighton's friend Henry Scott Holland wrote of him at the close of the "It seemed to us at Oxford almost incredible that a young don of any intellectual reputation for modernity should be on the Christian side." Quote, after some speculation by friends whether Creighton would commit to taking holy orders, he was ordained deacon by the Bishop of Oxford in 1870. He preached in first sermon in April 1871. Creighton spent many vacations in Europe. He fell in love with Italy, its scenery, its culture, and its people. This led naturally to a fascination with Renaissance Italy, which became his scholarly interest. He became an admirer of Walter Pater and the aesthetic movement. His rooms in Oxford were tastefully decorated with William Morris wallpaper and blue china. The furnishings brought admiration from friends and requests to view them from acquaintances. Creighton was now leading a life that was a far cry from that of his frugal student days. Upon his return from a vacation in Europe in early 1871, Creighton attended a lecture by art critic John Ruskin at the Sheldonian Theatre. After the lecture, he noticed his friend, the future author Humphrey Ward, talking to an unfamiliar young woman who was wearing a yellow scarf. Yellow was Creighton's favorite color. The scarf aroused his interest enough for him to ask Ward about the woman, whose name was Louise von Glen. Soon Ward was inviting Creighton and von Glen to a Valentine's Day lunch hosted in his rooms in Brasenose College. In a few weeks, von Glen found herself won over by Creighton's charm, and before she left Oxford at the end of the month, the two were engaged. They had agreed to be married the following winter. However, as Christmas approached, it was still not certain whether Merton College would waive its requirement of celibacy for its teaching fellows. On Christmas Eve, the college finally relented and elected 4 married fellows, one of whom was Creighton. Von Glen and Creighton were married on the 8th of January 1872 in her hometown of Sydenham, Kent. They spent a week honeymooning in Paris before returning to Oxford for Creighton's new teaching term. Like many Victorian scholars, Mandell Creighton assumed that his wife would be an accessory in his academic pursuits, and that he would have the upper hand in their intellectual relationship. During the courtship, he had written to her, "The nuisance of married life, strive as I may, or as you may, still the practical side of life must be much more prominent to me than to you. I shall have a number of things to do, whereas your sphere will be all within my reach and knowledge. Mine, on the other hand, will not in your reach entirely." In the summer of 1873, the couple took the first trip together to Italy. It was during this trip that Creighton made firm his intention to study the Renaissance popes for his life's research. During these years there were additions to the family. A daughter was born to the couple in the autumn of 1872, and another in the summer of 1874. With a growing family and a clear research plan, Creighton now began to doubt the long-term viability of his Merton tutorial fellowship. He felt increasingly that his teaching duties were sapping his stamina for focused intellectual labor. Around this time an opportunity arose for a rural living in a remote parish in coastal Northumberland to which Merton held the right of appointment, although varying counsel was offered by Louise, by Creighton's married colleagues, by his unmarried colleagues, and even by his students. His mind was made up when, in November 1874, the college finally offered the position of vicar of the parish of Embleton. Creighton eagerly accepted. Vicar of Embleton, 1875 to 1884. The village of Embleton lies on the North Sea coast in Northumberland, approximately midway between Edinburgh and Newcastle upon Tyne. The vicarage, then owned by Merton College and consisting of a fortified Pele tower built in the 14th century along with adjoining later additions, was a large establishment with many rooms for Creighton's growing family, their guests, and servants. The parish consisted of a handful of villages and approximately 1,700 inhabitants, among whom were farmers, whinstone quarrymen, herring and haddock fishermen, women workers in fish-curing yards, and railwaymen. Although the Creightons missed Oxford society and its stimulations, they gradually adapted to the new surroundings. With the help of a curate paid from his own funds, Creighton established a routine that enabled him to both carry out pastoral duty and write history. Each weekday morning, he spent 4 hours reading in the vicarage library. In the afternoons, Mandell, and whenever possible, Louise, visited the homes of the parishioners, listening to them, giving advice, offering prayers, conducting services for the housebound, and, on occasion, handing out homemade medical remedies. They found the parishioners to be reserved, proud, and independent, but could not help seeing them as lacking in morals. Their assessment of rampant alcoholism in Embleton led the Creightons, no teetotalers themselves, to found the local chapter of the Church of England Temperance Society and, in the process, to displease some locals, Louise organized meetings of the Mothers' Union as well as the Girls' Friendly Society, which aimed to empower girls, encouraging them, for example, to stay in school until the age of 14. Creighton's own family was growing. 4 more children were born during the Embleton years, and all were homeschooled, mostly by Louise. Creighton, who took great interest in the parish schools, served as examiner for other schools in the region, and began to formulate some ideas on the education of children. He was elected to local government bodies such as the Board of Guardians, which enacted poor laws in the region, and to the local sanitary authority. In 1879, he accepted his first leadership position in the Church of England. He was appointed Rural Dean of the Deanery of Alnwick, responsible for supervision of the clergy in neighbouring parishes. Later, he was appointed examining chaplain for the Bishop of Newcastle, Ernest Rowland Wilberforce, and tasked with examining candidates for holy orders. During the 10 years in Embleton, the Creightons, he in his 30s and she, for the most part, in her 20s, between them, wrote 15 books. They both wrote history books for young people. Louise wrote an unsuccessful novel, and Mandell wrote the first 2 volumes of his magnum opus, The History of the Papacy in the Period of Reformation. In the Papacy volumes, Creighton proposed that the turbulence of the Reformation became inevitable when the popes obstructed the milder parliamentary reforms that had been advocated earlier. The books were well received and were commended for their even-handed approach. Lord Acton, who reviewed the books in the Academy and who was aware that the books were written over a few years in a northern vicarage far from the centres of scholarship, wrote, "The history of increasing depravity and declining faith, of reforms earnestly demanded, feebly attempted, and deferred too long, is told by Mr. Creighton with a fullness of accuracy unusual in works which are the occupation of a lifetime." Creighton also read dozens of book reviews and scholarly articles. Among them were his first forays into the role of the Church of England in the life of the nation. Throughout the 19th century, the Church had suffered erosion of membership. In the mid-century, many scholars such as the educator Thomas Arnold had asserted the identity of the Church and the nation. However, as the century entered its last 2 decades, Creighton was among a small minority continuing to do the same. In 1884, Creighton was asked to apply for the newly created professorship of Ecclesiastical History, the Dixie chair, at the University of Cambridge and a concurrent fellowship at Emmanuel College. His application proved successful, and on the 9th of November 1884, Creighton preached his last sermon at Embleton Church. Later, he was to write, "At Embleton I spent 10 years, and I have no hesitation in saying that they were the 10 happiest years of my life." His parishioners, for their part, found it difficult to express the feelings openly. One woman said, "Well, if you ain't done no good, you've done no harm."